tonight's presentation was really going to be going deeper into Waldorf education, looking deeper at it from the perspective of particularly parents who have been here for a while at our school and who want to know a little bit more. But looking around the room, I can see some new faces, which is great. So I'm going to just rejig it a little bit so that hopefully I can give a perspective that will hopefully reach everyone's level of questioning and everyone's need to know more about Waldorf education. So I'd love to have questions, and I think it's best just to have questions whenever you feel that you would like to ask them. So if there's something that I've said that you think, well, that's interesting, I'd like to know more about that, just wink or something or nod, and I will know that you need to ask it. Okay, so for those who don't know me, I'm Aegir Morgan. I won't spell my first name. It will probably confuse you hugely. I was born in Iceland, and my mum thought it'd be quite funny to call me after a Norse god, who is, even in Iceland, is not a very popular name. So you go to Iceland, I think, okay, at least I can say, here, this is my name, and they'll understand me, but they don't. It's a bit like being called Poseidon or Zeus or something. And I've been the principal at the Waldorf School for 3 years. Before that, I was working as a class teacher at the Waldorf School. So I've been at the Waldorf School in Whistler for 7 years. And before that, I was working in schools in the UK. So I've been at this now for 15 years, started when I was 26. So you can see by the colour of my hair how teaching can be for you when you're only just over 40. So anyway, Waldorf education has been a big part of my life. I was also a Waldorf student for 4 years. Went to a Waldorf school when I was in grade 7. And I had been one of those students who had absolutely loved my early education. I'd loved my preschool, my primary education, my elementary. And then I went to a very large school, 1,500 students, and something about it just didn't quite fit. I didn't really know many of the teachers' names, they didn't really know me, so my parents started looking around and they found there was this other style of education called Waldorf. It's an instant fit for me. I stayed there for 4 years, and I left when I was at the end of grade 10 and finished off my education elsewhere. So I feel, from a student's perspective, I also had a foot in both styles of education. I had a public school education up till 12, Waldorf for 4 years, and then another public school education afterwards. So I like to think of myself as someone who hopefully is not too evangelical about Waldorf education, even though I've decided it's the path for me and the path that I want to be working in. So to start, I wanted to bring a perspective on Waldorf education historically, to really go into where did this education come from, how did it get created, and who created it. So it's coming up to its 100th birthday. In 1919, a man called Rudolf Steiner, who was a philosopher, a scientist, an astronomer, a farmer, you name it, he did it. He was interested in medicine, he was interested in communities for handicapped people. He had far-reaching interests, and throughout most of his life he followed these interests and explored them in an attempt to discover what is the human being? What is the human being really about? When he was a young man, he tutored a boy who had developmental difficulties, what we might well call these days ADHD or Asperger's, who knows what it was that this boy had. But over the time that he tutored him, in the way in which he taught him, he cured this boy of this developmental delay, and this boy went on to become a doctor and a very successful human being. While he was tutoring him, his parents thought, well, there's nothing you can do with him. He's totally lost. He's not responding to education. He's not really getting it. But by looking at this boy as not just someone who was going to be fitting into society, but someone who was a human being in their own right, an independent human being, and trying to identify what does this particular boy need, he was able to unlock the pathway to success for this particular pupil. But it wasn't until much later in his life that he went back to education. So it was 6 years before he died, actually, when the first Waldorf school was opened. 1919, of course, a year of great upheaval in Europe. He was born in Austria. He was born in what is now Croatia, but it was part of Austria then. And of course, in 1919, Europe was in ashes after the First World War. It was in a state of disarray, a state of chaos. And one of the big questions at that time was, well, how can we develop an educational system or an educational approach that's going to help us avoid that sort of calamity? And he was actually approached by the owner of a factory who was interested in his ideas and said to him, do you think there's a way that we can educate human beings so that they will be peaceful and they'll be community-oriented and aware of each other as human beings, and we won't have this calamity happening again? And he responded, yes, absolutely there is. Next question was, well, could you help us start a school on those ideals that would help us to achieve this? And so he was responding to a question, really, from one of his friends. And the first Waldorf school was born. And this is in April 1919. By September, he had gathered together all the people that he thought were really suitable teachers to start this first initiative and to start this first Waldorf school. But he didn't go out and recruit strictly teachers. He wanted to recruit people who he thought had something to offer to this school and to create this new style of education, whether they were teachers or not. And this is really central to Waldorf education, that it's about the connection between human beings that really matters. He was very interested in humanity and what humanity really means. At that time, 1919, of course, the Victorian era education system had really just been about how do we get children to fit into particularly the workplace. How can they become useful to society? It's a very utilitarian way of looking at it. And he turned it completely on his head and asked the question, really, how can we prepare human beings so that they can meet the outer world in freedom, but so they can also know the inner world? And that question had really not been asked since ancient Greek times. And so he brought about this new perspective for education. How can we educate the human beings so that they will know themselves, they will have a strong understanding of who they are as an individual, where are they going in their lives, and then when they come to the point of leaving school, being able to freely choose their path and their destiny in life, without being swayed solely by the needs of society. Very radical for 1919. For 2014, not so radical. We're beginning now to really, this style of education is coming into the public system as well as into independent schools. So the first Waldorf school started with this in mind. How do we create well-rounded human beings who know themselves and who know the world? So by gathering these individuals together, a school community was created, and this new school movement was created. And now that school had 125 students, I think, when it first opened. Now we've got about 1,000 Waldorf schools around the world in various different countries and every continent, and it's the fastest growing independent school movement in the world at the moment. So it's gathered pace, and it's really picking up, and people are seeming to want to know more about this educational style. So our school in Whistler is trying to keep this spirit alive, the spirit of how do we educate in a sane, holistic way that will enable students to be free individuals who are able to choose their own path in life. Well, it sounds really wonderful, and of course I'm sure all of you think, well, that's great, I fully agree with that, but how do you achieve that? So Steiner put forward this idea that the human being, the child, has to be at the center of this education experience. It can't be that the teachers and the adults around them are deciding amongst themselves what they feel is purely the best for children to then go and fit into society. But we as adults and as educators have to observe very, very closely the children that are in our care. And from that very close observation, and from age-appropriate activities, then start to identify who is this person and where are they going. And so our task as Waldorf teachers is very much to do that, to observe, to watch, to try and identify what are the obstacles for this child in becoming the full human being that they are fully able to become. So, firstly, he put forward this idea that we've got to look at education in a way that's fully linked to human development. We've got to observe first and then come up with the educational system to fit that. So the first thing he noticed is that students really for the first 7 years should be in an environment that is calm, that's beautiful, that has goodness at its heart, and that is really led by someone who has, in many ways, the instinct for that, to retain the magic of childhood for those first 7 years. And actually, the first 7 years of education in Waldorf schools only came about through a need, really, that parents had. Because when Steiner was asked, well, what would you do for those first 7 years? Because at first he put forward just this idea for 7 and beyond. But then he was asked, well, what do you do for those first 7 years? And his answer was, the child needs to be ideally at home for those first 7 years. But if you are going to have an education that reaches the 0 to 7 age bracket, it needs to be in an environment that closely mirrors the home environment as much as possible. So the Waldorf kindergarten experience is trying to mirror as much as possible that home experience, the home life. Children bake, they sweep, they do all that sort of stuff that we do at home. They paint, they bake bread regularly. They're doing. They're involved in developing their physical capabilities. And so he said the first 7 years really need to be given over to the physical health of the child. The child needs to be able to develop their physical body without the forces, the formative life forces that all of us have, being diverted into other activities that stop that from happening. So then the question was, well, what about reading and writing and academic work? Absolutely not, he said. The first 7 years need to be given over just purely to learning to be a human being in the way that we know it. You know, learning to use our hands, learning to use our arms, learning to use our physical bodies in a way that will enable us to just become at home with who we are in our physical selves. And then after the first 7 years, he put forward this idea that a new phase is started. And this is where it gets a little bit deeper. He said actually a new body is born. Steiner was very open to the concept and very interested in the concept of the spirit, the human spirit, and the human soul. And he wanted that to be front and center in the education approach. That we shouldn't just be educating for skills, for cerebral prowess, but that we need to be also educating children's spirits, also their soul life. And I'll get onto that a little bit more a little bit later. But that second 7-year period, he said, is the beginning of a new phase where the child's life body, is what he called it, is born. And he said you can notice when this happens in a child because they start to lose their teeth. And this is a sign, a physical sign, that a new phase is being started, a new body is being released that can now be put towards other things. That life force is being used to build the human physical body, the organs, the body, the brain, everything. Those life forces are going into that part of the human being. But now at the age of 6 or 7, he says that there's a change. These forces are released, and those forces now can be used or can be directed into more formal learning. So that's when school can really begin. So in common day language, he called it the etheric body back in those days. It's a little bit of a strange term for us these days. But if we were to put it into modern speak, it would be chi energy. Or for those of you who are interested in yoga, it would be the pranic energy that is released at that age that can now be used for academic and for school-related work. But he said the next 7-year period really needs to be now about educating the soul life of the child. So it needs to be about the feeling life and the imaginative life. And so yes, we start academic work and we start letters and we start numbers, but it has to be done through the prism of artistic education, through a creative approach. So Waldorf education is often known as being an artistic education. It is an artistic education. It is not an art education. So he was very clear in saying that we're not going to just be teaching the children art. And many times I get asked that question, well, aren't Waldorf schools those art schools where they get to just do art all the time? It's absolutely not true. They don't just do art all the time. They do art, a lot of it, but it's not the only thing they do. He put forward this idea that you can do academic work through artistic activity. And the idea there was to bind the spiritual soul aspect of the human being with the physical life force aspect. He said there's something about art and teaching artistically and teaching creatively which allows this sort of synthesis to take place between all the different parts of the human being. So if you can educate creatively and artistically for that next 7-year period, you're going to really develop a child's imaginative capacities and their capacities for empathy, their capacities for morality, for ethics, for imagination. And if any of you have got 7, 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, they've all got incredibly strong imaginations. And they want to use their imaginations. They want those imaginations to be educated. So in that second 7-year period, we start with academic work. But it's done through storytelling, it's done through artistic activity, through song, anything that really meets the child in that developmental stage. So that turns things a little bit on its on its head a bit, because there's so much pressure, particularly these days, a lot of pressure for sooner the better. And Waldorf education is very much the total opposite to that in many ways. That we'll do it when we're ready. We'll do it when the child is ready. And interestingly, recent studies and recent research, particularly in the countries in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Finland, for example, Switzerland, all the research is showing that if you hold off on academic work until the age of 7, it's going to give you academic longevity, and it's going to allow intellectual capacities to develop much later that do not develop particularly well at that particular time. So brain science is beginning to recognize that the part of the brain that you use for academic work and for abstract work is not fully developed at 7, actually. It's developed a little bit later in the child. And so, well, it's not developed particularly younger, and so it's Waldorf Education's mission to really try and hold off on that, to not have children doing too much academic work too soon. Now again, it's just an approach, and for many students and for many parents that's not the path they want to choose. But this was something that took hold for many parents, and this first Waldorf school suddenly turned into another Waldorf school and another one, and people began to get very excited by this idea and this movement, and it just spread and has been spreading ever since. What about the third 7-year period? Well, at this point he said there's another body that's born. So you've got the first 7 years there, you've got the physical. The second 7 years, you've got this life force that's released, and now you can start to work on the soul and the imagination. And then at 14, a new beginning, and that's the birth of what he called at the time the astral body, which sounds incredibly new age to our modern day speak, but is essentially the emotional body of the child is released, and the emotional work has now been done. And now what we can do is we can start to really develop the intellect. And so the last 7-year period in the Waldorf approach is about developing intellectual capacities of the child and making sure that we are honing the skills of fine critical thinking and of the ability to be able to think really out of the box. Now that second 7-year period is very much about thinking as well. So don't think for a second that it's really about we're just singing songs and painting pictures and that's pretty much it. The second 7-year period is really about developing the thinking, but through the prism of art, right? But the third 7-year period is really more about now still keeping that artistic approach, but it's much more now about developing independent thinking. And then he went a little bit further and said at 21, because this is where, that's where education ends then. But at 21, he said a new consciousness is born, an I consciousness, a new consciousness of who you are as a human being. He said it's absolutely our task as Waldorf educators to make sure that when they reach that point of I consciousness, they know who I is, and they know where they want to go with their lives, or at least they know themselves well enough to be able to direct themselves on their journey. So with our approach also, it's very much teacher-led. The teacher is front and center of the Waldorf approach. And Steiner made this really, really clear in way back then in 1919, that it's really about who's educating the children that's the most important thing. It's not what are they being taught. It's not what are they learning. It's not how are they learning. Those things are important, but it's who's doing the teaching. That's the big question that we have to really ask ourselves. Who is doing the teaching? Because it's through the teacher that the child will gain their understanding of this education that's being brought to them. And I'm sure everyone in the room can probably testify to that when you think back to your education, you probably think back to the teachers who taught you. And you might well think back to, well, I really loved science because of Mr. Graham. He was great. Made it really fun, really made it very interesting. And because there was something about him that brought this experience of science to me in a way that I really understood and really got. So at the end of his training course in that summer of 1919, which by the way lasted 2 weeks, an unbelievably short training course where he just taught non-stop throughout every day, but remember he'd already handpicked the people that he knew were going to be expert teachers, and so he just spent 2 weeks with them honing their skills. And in those 2 weeks he said the Waldorf teacher needs to be someone first and foremost of initiative. They need to be able to take initiative. They need to have life experience, and they need to be able to bring something to the children through their biography and through who they are as a person. So that also was an interesting new perspective. Up until that point, education really had been about drilling the children on skills. Doesn't matter who's doing it. You've got your list of things that you need to get through, and you get through it as best as you can. And that worked for the post-industrial revolution era, where students and children were really being, in many ways, prepared for the workplace and for this new industrial environment that was there. But Waldorf education took it in a different direction. It's not so much about what the children are learning, but who is teaching them. So he put down this challenge to us Waldorf teachers to make sure that we stay fresh in our souls, that we nourish ourselves enough to be able to bring things to students that are of worth and that are interesting and that are engaging, and most importantly that show we are thinking about a particular student's path in life, and that we're using our insights to try and ascertain and glean through observation, what does this child need? So the Waldorf teacher is very, very central to this style of education too. There is a curriculum, and the curriculum is pretty much the same no matter which Waldorf school you go to. But he also warned Waldorf teachers, don't let it become too rigid. The Waldorf curriculum is elastic. It can move a little bit. So if there is a need to adjust that curriculum a little bit, by all means do so, because the teacher hopefully will be able to really identify what exactly it is that the child needs. And if they are able then to think, well, what they need right now is not particularly this subject, but they need this particular other subject, then there should be the freedom to do that. For the most part, the Waldorf curriculum is set. And we follow it because it works, and we know it works. It has worked for over 100 years, and it seems to be working just more and more. So there's a great faith in the curriculum that he indicated could be followed. But he said there has to be freedom in the way in which teachers teach. So the first Waldorf school is actually called the Freie Waldorfschule, which means the free Waldorf school, because it was very clear that ideally, Waldorf education should be free from the icy fingers of the state. And at that time, you can understand why that was so important. 20 million men had just lost their lives in a catastrophe that had been brought about really by rampant nationalism, with countries jockeying for position, trying to get their little piece of the pie, and industrializing, and then like big bullies in the play yard, coming together with a big fight. So there was a great need for this shift away from that way of thinking. There had to be a new way of thinking where human beings could be free without being shackled by nationalism and without being shackled by state control. So the first Waldorf schools were very much independent schools in the way that they were not connected to the state, so that their mandate, if you like, could remain free, and they could be free to do what they thought was the best thing for the children. But over the years, education has changed enormously, and of course has become much, much more progressive, much more open to new ideas and new approaches, not just in the independent sector, but in the public sector too. So it's a great climate right now for public-private partnership, if you like. So our school, as all independent schools in BC, receive 50% funding from the government, and it's an interesting partnership to have. So there's a recognition that there are many approaches to education, and they should all be recognised and should all be supported. So to sort of round that little section off there, at the centre of this approach is the child and the development of the child and the observations of the things that happen to human beings. And if you were to trace back over your biography, which is what every Waldorf teacher has to do as part of their training, to first get to know themselves, who am I, before I can stand in front of a group of children and present to them something. You've got to know who you are first. So the first thing that we do is we go through our biographies and we try and identify, what influences have I been under, what things have I experienced in my life, and try and identify times where perhaps this idea of these 3 7-year periods has relevance for me. So we run a course up at the school there for new teachers that is about that. And it's remarkable how many people have identified that, yes, there was a big change in my consciousness when I turned 14, or a massive change in my consciousness when I turned 7. And then likewise, 21, this happened and this happened. I deal with these things that were very much about me and I and where am I going and what is my path. But then he also put forward this idea that it doesn't stop there. And this is really important as well about Waldorf education. Our perspective is not, let's get the kids to graduation and then bye-bye, see you later. Our approach is very much, what is that child going to be like when they're 50 years old? What are they going to need when they're 50? Or what are we going to be able to do for these children that will avoid them having a midlife crisis when they're 40 perhaps? Or avoid them developing illnesses at an early age. And Steiner was really interested in this relationship between education and illness. And quite often he would say these really outlandish things like, if you do too much academic work with a child, they may get sclerosis when they're in their 50s. And of course everyone's like, wow, how would you even come up with an idea like that? And that's a big question. I don't know whether science has looked into that really in great depth, if there is a correlation between education and illness. But one thing that science has definitely proven is that there is a definite relationship between stress and illness, and there's a definite relationship between stress and mental anxiety and developmental difficulties. So ideally what we're striving to do is to give the children a sane approach to education that allows them to be children, that allows them to unfold at a time and in a way that is good for them, so that they don't develop these anxieties that can perhaps later lead to stress, which could then later lead to illness. But being a human being is a big lesson in anxiety, isn't it? Something we have to just deal with continuously. So for us, we're constantly just watching really as the students in our care and trying as much as possible to guide them and to give them the leadership that they need, but also try and recognize, what is it that they are telling us that they also need. So really at the center of this approach, and the center of Steiner's ideas, was this idea of the human being at the center. And his philosophy, so his body of knowledge that he developed over his life, and the books and the lectures that he gave really sort of helped solidify this. His philosophy is known as anthroposophy. Anthro, meaning human being, and posophy, or Sophia, meaning knowledge. So it was very important to him that there was this knowledge of the human being really at the center, that was the most important thing in education. So as you go on through your lives, of course, you said you go through different phases, and those 7-year periods, you said, still apply. You still go through these different changes in your life. If you can be aware of those, then it can often help you through through your life's journey. So the time of 21 was really about this I consciousness, but then he said when you get to the age of 28, you develop this new form of consciousness where your sentient soul, is what he called it, which is where you, over the previous 7 years, have been garnering as many sense experiences as you possibly can. Think back to your 20s. 20 to 28, very much this time of, I want to soak up as many sense experiences as I can. And that next 7 year period, he calls that the sentient soul period, where you're just soaking up sensory experiences. And then the next period he calls the mind soul part of your development, where you now begin to use all these experiences that you've had, all these sort of sensory experiences you've had, all the experiences you've had in education, and you're now able to think about organizing all of that into something. And so often for people, the 28 to 35 period is when they started a family, or when they really decided, well, this is my path as far as my work is concerned, and my task in life is this. So often I've met people who, when they turn 28, were just like, okay, that's what I know, that's what I want to do. And this is my task. They begin to organize their lives a little bit, perhaps. And then 35 onwards, for the next 7 year period, he personified as the consciousness soul period, where suddenly we develop a new sense of consciousness, where we are able to now come away from this, where we've been organizing our own lives, and come up a little bit more to this. My consciousness for the world now is reaching a new stage. So I don't know how many of us have experienced that. I'm 40. I'm apparently in my consciousness soul period right now. So this is the point where you're meant to be really thinking about, well, what good can I do for humanity? What can I do to better the world? And what can I do to do my part to make this world a better place? Those are often questions that form in that 7 year period. And that's a question that's brought me right here in this moment, right now, talking to you, is that this is something that comes about often at this time in your life. And then after that, he said, it's just spiritual wisdom. And ideally, 42 onwards, you become one of those sages who just knows everything about everything, and who's incredibly wise, and everyone wants to learn from. And then he talks about old age. He said, when you get to old age, you know those people who just emanate wisdom? You know, those people in your life where you just think, they've just got it, so sorted, and they just know exactly what they want to do with themselves, and they've got all this wisdom to share with everyone else. The archetypal grandfather or grandmother, come and sit on my knee, and I will tell you all the lovely things that I've got, sort of polished nut. Ideally, so if you've gone through these phases in a very healthy way, and you've had those educational experiences that give you the grounding to be able to unfold as a human being in a very healthy way, you'll get to that point in your life. And so to then put that picture back into the perspective that we have as Waldorf educators, we are dealing with children who we want to have experience a life that unfolds in a way that allows them to become truly human, and to perhaps get to that point where they become the polished nut themselves, and they are able to be that wise sage that they might be. But who knows, maybe that's not their particular path. But that's the question we're always asking. What can we do for the future for this child? Not just how do we stop Johnny from misbehaving, because he's really disrupting the class. That's definitely a question that we ask, of course, quite regularly. Don't think we've got a Johnny in the school, have we? No, a few, okay, good. But the question we then ask is, well, why is Johnny misbehaving? What's going on there? And then as a group of teachers, we get together every week to look at that child, to do a child study on them, where we build up a picture of who is this child, and then we try and come up at the question of why is he misbehaving. So rather than dealing with the symptom of behavior, we try and go a little bit deeper to find out, well, what's driving that? So the first thing we do is, as teachers in our teachers meeting, is we'll choose a particular child, and we will have ideally spent the previous week really observing that child together as a group. And then we share pictures of that child together. First, the thing we do is the physical. What does this child look like? Let's build up a picture. Do they have wide shoulders? How do they run? How do they walk? How do they move? Are there any physical aspects of them that we're not really aware of? How do they shake hands with you in the morning? In the Waldorf school, we ask the children to shake hands with us every morning. It's a very powerful thing, because you have to meet one another, and you have to look into one another's eyes, and there's something that takes place there. There's an exchange of, here I am, there you are, and we are meeting, and our journey is going to begin. That's just one day. So as us as teachers in that meeting, we try and really build that picture of the child so we can meet that child. Who is this child physically? And then we look at, well, who is this child in respect to their habit life, their work life? How do they relate to work? What sort of work do they do in school? And are they always ready to go outside for recess time? There's insights like that will help us discern their life body, that etheric body that I was talking to you about. That's that second 7-year period when that's born. And then we'll ask each other, well then, how does this child relate to other human beings? Are they explosive with their classmates? Are they reticent with their classmates? How do they relate to adults around them? We'll build that picture up, because then that's building up, ideally, a picture of this emotional body that is born when they are 14. But, it's still there. It's there in us human beings. All these bodies are there in us in seed form. They're just fully born at certain times of our development. But they're always there. So as Waldorf teachers, we try and identify, well, what's their emotional body like? And what's going on in their emotional life right now? And then finally, we'll ask the question of this I consciousness question. Who is this child? And then we might pause for a second and think, well, also, where are they going? What do we imagine this child to become? Who is this child going to become? And what are they going to become? They're not just always going to become a fireman, or always going to become a secretary, or whatever it might be. But what can we see here that might be, what is this child trying to tell us? Where are they going in life? And we try and picture that forward as well. Now sometimes it might not always work out, and sometimes it might be that we can't nail it. We don't understand what it is, and we can't figure it out. But for the most part, working together as a group, as a faculty, we're able to use each other's insights and to crack the problem. And that's continuously going on through our approach. That's not so, oh great, we've got little Johnny in grade 1, we figured him out, that's fantastic, he's going to be great for the next 15 years. It's much deeper than that. We'll have our eye on looking out for Johnny to make sure that he is unfolding in the way that we hope he can unfold. So that's another big part of Waldorf education, the colleagueship between the faculty. And Steiner put forward this idea that really the faculty should be coming together every week to sit together in a meeting as part of a ongoing teacher training seminar, where they'll learn from each other. So peer mentorship, if you like. So we have this meeting where the teachers will get together, and we'll have the openness, hopefully, to allow teachers to just come and say, I had a terrible day today. It didn't work out. I did something really bad in the lesson today. And then, as a group, we're able to help. We're able to teach each other how to become better people and how to become better teachers. Another big part of Waldorf education, close colleagueship, and the importance of a group around students. And then that also brings me on to the community aspect of Waldorf education, how you and us as faculty are really the community around your child. And we try as much as possible to deepen that, to bring parents in to the conversation, to allow you to have also, a very important role in surrounding this child with the energy and the insights that they will need to unfold in a healthy way. So we recognize that the parents are a very, very important part of this process. We can't do it alone. The teachers cannot do this alone. And likewise, parents, I'm a parent myself, you need help sometimes. Sometimes you need to be able to go to the teachers and say, I just don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on. Can you help? And ideally, through this bond that's created between the teacher and the pupil and the parent, you can get to the crux of the issue that much better. And so that is a very central part of the Waldorf approach, this idea that we are working together as a community for the best of the child. So at the center of that also is the fact that we want to build relationship. And that's really manifested through the class teacher approach, which is, in Waldorf schools, usually a class teacher will strive to stay with that one particular class, ideally for 7 years. 8 years in some schools. Or at least for as long as they can, as long as they feel that this relationship is working and it's fruitful. Some schools are beginning to work with the model of, well, one teacher will take from grade 1 to grade 4, and then another teacher may come in at grade 5 and take from grade 5 up to grade 7. Because it's recognized that not everyone can educate a grade 1 student, and 7 years later, when they become 14-year-olds, have the same skill, or have the set of skills to be able to educate a 14-year-old as well. Some people can do that, and those Waldorf teachers are very gifted and are able to then develop this deep relationship with the children in their care over a course of 7 years. There's an amazing opportunity to really get to know a student and to get to know a family. So if you've been working non-stop with a student for 7 years, you're going to know them really well. And if you've been working with their parents, you're going to know the parents really well too. And they're going to know you, and therefore you're going to develop, hopefully, a better capacity of knowing what's right for your child. But that's the second 7-year period. The first 7-year period is really about the kindergarten teachers leading through example, leading through strong, clear leadership. And then the third 7-year period, the teacher's role changes very much to not being this gardener who's tending the garden, but now being someone who's a specialist and who really knows what they're talking about, and who is someone who has mastered their topic to a degree in which the teenager will trust them. Because for a teenager, their consciousness shifts hugely when they get to 15, changes dramatically, and they start to think, well, hang on, who are these people? Who are these people, my parents? I don't have to always do what they say. Well, that's interesting. What if I don't say I'm going to do that? And the same thing happens with the teachers. Who's this teacher? Have they got anything of worth that they're going to bring to me? It's a really valid question. I think it's a great question. That's why I love particularly working with teenagers, because they do bring this question sometimes in a very inappropriate way, and sometimes in a very challenging way. But what they're really asking is, who are you? And what's your relevance for me? Because this emotional body that's born at 14 is really all about me. And if you think back to that time in your life, it's a very introspective time. Who am I? But then also, who am I in relationship to you? And who am I in relationship to my friends, or my gang, or my posse? Because now it suddenly becomes about how do I relate to the world in my unique way, but also in a way that I can feel like I'm part of something. So the teacher then has to make a real shift to become suddenly someone who's a little bit removed, a little bit, there's a bit of space now between the pupil and the teacher. And here I am, this person who's done all this research and done all this education. Yes, and I have a degree. Because the teenagers, what are your qualifications? Should you be in this job? What do you do before this? And they want to know who's teaching me now, who's doing the teaching. And so that's something the teacher then has to shift to. Okay, I'm going to be this authority in my subject. That second 7-year period more, I'm just going to be an authority in who I am as a person. But now when they get to 14, the students want clear guidance in the subject and the content. But having said that role then also needs to be, you're a teenager now, yes, you're developing your own sense of yourself, and you've got this raging emotional body, which is really exciting and really interesting, but you still need my guidance. And actually you'll need my guidance until, according to Steiner's perspective on development, until you're 21, and until you've got that I consciousness to then be able to decide for yourself where you're going in your life. So for us as educators of teenagers, we have to be very much aware of that space, but at the same time be ready to step in when things go awry, because things go awry in your teenage years, and you need people there who are going to be able to support you and to prop you up. Your parents, hopefully, teachers and parents would be ideal. And then what happens, hopefully, in those teenage years, they develop a trust for the adult world, rather than what is very common, a distrust for the adult world, and begin to find their connections to people elsewhere, whether it might be role models, whether it might be other people's parents, whether it might be the drug dealer, or whether it might be drugs, in fact. Where am I going to find my grounding? And ideally, if we can make the shift as adults to be able to meet them through that developmental phase, there isn't the need so much to go into that on that path. So that gives you a little perspective of the Waldorf teacher, who is central to this approach. It's very much about who is doing the teaching. And when we have, we've grown enormously over the last 4 years in particular. So of course for us, we've had to really staff our growth, because now suddenly, we were a school of 40 students 7 years ago. Now we're a school of 220 students. So for myself and for those on our hiring committee, we've really had to think, well, how do we staff this growth? And the first thing we ask ourselves is who is the candidate that's coming towards us? Yes, I receive resumes on my desk and we'll look over all their qualifications, but we're not really interested in that as much as we are, well, who's the person who's walking through the door right now? And so what we've done recently is we've identified educators, much like Steiner did actually way back in the early days, identify those people in our community, those educators who have got what it takes for this work that I've just been outlining. This ability to be able to shift, to be flexible, to have self-reflection, to be able to intuit what children need, and to be able to use their insights to develop a capacity for quality education. And so that's really the approach that we take, is who are our teachers? And we're very blessed to have a great faculty of teachers who have been in many ways drawn to what we're doing there. They've often heard about the Waldorf School. It's kind of interesting. What's going on there? I'm interested. And they'll take a step towards that. And then we identify, oh yeah, this person actually is is a Waldorf teacher. And yes, they may have Waldorf training. Quite often they do have Waldorf training, which has given them that depth. But it might be someone, okay, they don't have Waldorf training, but they have the right capacities, so we will train them. And so then those teachers come into our school and we train them on the job, and that's been very successful for us as well. So yeah, the Waldorf teacher very much at the heart of this approach. Okay, that's really as far as I'm going to go for now, but I'd love to have some questions so that we can go a little bit deeper. And don't be shy to ask questions about, spirit, for example. When you mention the word spirit, suddenly for some people their alarm bells go off. Whoa, hang on, is this a religious education? I really welcome those questions, because Waldorf education is definitely a spiritual education. We definitely take into account the spiritual dimension of the human being, but in a non-denominational way. So we're very much looking at the human being with the question of, is there a spiritual aspect to the human being? And we're going to work with that question. But there might well be. Okay, so if there is, how are we going to educate that spirit? And then likely, in the same vein, you mentioned the word soul. For many people, what do you mean by soul? So many different ways of interpreting that word. Physical body, that's a little bit easier to understand. Although, to be honest with you, in this day and age, go into any health food shop, you see the words mind, body, spirit, or body, soul, spirit. It's there in our consciousness. It's beginning to come into our consciousness. Whether it was you asked someone in 1919 in Western society, unless they were particularly attached to a religious tradition, there wouldn't have been that same openness, perhaps, to spirit that Steiner was interested in. He wasn't really interested in, which faith are you? He's more interested in, is there such a thing as a spirit? And can we educate to that? Can we take that into account? But again, just to remind you, Steiner didn't come up with this education until quite late in his life. So it was quite a lot later than when he had done all these other initiatives. Biodynamic farming was many of you in Pemberton will have heard about that. Some of the organic farms are also biodynamic farms. That was something that Steiner came up with. Valeda health products, you probably know, from the health food shop here in town, you can go in there, lots of Valeda health products. He's very interested in using natural substances to heal. Actually, there's a whole institute in Switzerland that's been built up around a comment that Steiner made at the end of his life, that mistletoe holds the cure to cancer. And so there's a clinic being set up in Switzerland. So like, okay, this guy seems to know a lot about a lot of things. So let's figure out, is there something in mistletoe that will be the cure to cancer? So he's very interested in how nature can inform our lives and how it can influence our lives. And he was very interested also in beekeeping. He saw bees as being something that was central to human development. And look at what's going on right now. Bees have suddenly become front and center in the news headlines because of their importance to us as human beings. So there were many far-reaching ideas that he had. But I'm sure many of you, and many of our parents actually, might not have even heard of Rudolf Steiner. He's one of those obscure figures who, for some reason, he was a contemporary of Freud, contemporary of Jung. We know all about Freud and all about Jung, but there was something that was a bit problematic about Steiner, because he was very, very far-reaching in his ideas and way, way ahead of his time. And so still, I think we're beginning to sort of get to grips with the ideas that he put forward. One idea that he put forward, Waldorf education, has really taken root and is doing really well. Biodynamic farming has taken root and is also doing very, very well. Anthroposophical medicine is becoming very popular as well. And I just think that all these ideas that he came with, and the Camp Hill community, this idea that physically handicapped people could benefit from an experience of crafts and the experience of working with textiles and working together in a community would be beneficial to their unfolding as human beings. So there are Camp Hill communities all over the world that are dedicated to a haven, a place for human beings with physical disabilities to be able to go and work through crafts to create capacities that will serve them in the future. So Camp Hill communities have also become quite well known. So that's kind of Waldorf 101 with 201, because I would have gone perhaps a little bit in a different direction if it had just been Sheila and Christy and Diane and maybe a few others. But it's great that there are people here who know nothing about Waldorf education, so I'm hopeful that I've been able to fill in a few gaps there, and that my softly spoken English accent has managed to go over the discotheque next door.
Sorry.
But yeah, questions?
Do you think Waldorf education is for every type of child?
I'd love to say yes. And I think many people in the Waldorf movement would say absolutely yes, it's for every child, because it meets every aspect of the human being. It's a balance between hand activities, physical activities, heart activities, feeling activities, and intellectual activities. So in many ways there's something there in Waldorf education for everyone, and we, as much as possible in our lessons, ask ourselves, have we educated the hands? Have we educated the heart? Have we educated the head in an appropriate way? And if they're at a Waldorf school right the way through, from preschool to 18, seeing some of the graduates who have come out of Waldorf schools, and when they come out at 18 with this sort of full grounding, this full self-knowledge, this sense of confidence in who they are, this unswerving ability to be able to direct their own lifelong learning. If you look at it in that way, I'd say yes, it is for everyone. But in my experience as a Waldorf teacher, it's often been that sometimes, it's not. Sometimes it's not a fit. And Steiner was a believer in karma and reincarnation. And he put forward this idea that we are perhaps educating human beings who have had a previous life. Now that's problematic, because then of course the question we get asked is, well then are you all religious fanatics or you're spiritual? Absolutely not. Many Waldorf teachers have no, I won't say no interest in that, but they may have no strong beliefs in that area. But he did put forward this idea, which a visiting mentor reminded me of, that sometimes a child's path is not to have a Waldorf education. And sometimes for them it isn't the fit. And often we've had parents who are like, I want a Waldorf education for my child. I love Waldorf. It's amazing. It's the best thing in the world and this is what I want. And they try and they try and they try, but for the child it's like, no, this isn't what I want. And there have been a few cases where we've recognized, yeah, actually, maybe this isn't what this child needs. But more often than not, that child and that family will then come back in a few years' time and it will be a good fit. So perhaps for certain children it's not a good fit at a certain time. But I have to say for most, I've been working in this field for 15 years. I've never known of a student who has started a Waldorf education and then it's not been a fit for them. So I think more often than not, it's students who are coming in perhaps from another approach, and Waldorf education is new, it's odd, it's different, it's not like how they had it before, and then that's where you might have the "this isn't a fit" experience. So thank you very much for coming. It's been a pleasure, and I hope I've been able to answer a few questions about Waldorf education or give you a little bit more insight. And if not, then you can make a complaint to the school, or you can phone me, send an email, make an inquiry. Diane's our front of house person, and she's very amenable, and will point you in the right direction if you have any questions at all. So we welcome questions, and if you want to come and visit, we have open houses. You can check out the website.